morning. The Committee on Homeland Security, subcommittees on counterterrorism and intelligence, and oversight, management, efficiency will come to order. Subcommittees are meeting today in a joint hearing to examine threats to the Department of Homeland Security supply chain and assess tools and authorities for DHS to mitigate those threats. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. There is no question that nation-states and criminal actors are constantly trying to exploit U.S. government and private sector systems to steal information or insert potentially harmful hardware or software. The recent cases involving Kaspersky, ZTE, and Huawei underscore the threats posed to the Federal supply chain and the urgency in developing stronger mechanisms to secure it. In March 2017, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, released a background paper on the supply chain risk management stating, quote, even as the U.S. government and private sector have implemented programs to mitigate and counter supply chain threats, the evolution of directed, sophisticated, and multifaceted threats threatens to outpace our countermeasures. Traditional remedies such as trade agreements, economic sanctions, and legal actions are reactionary in nature and cannot keep pace with the evolution of threats. The Federal Government is behind the curve in establishing robust supply chain security measures. It is clear that additional tools, policies, resources, and legal authorities are urgently needed to address this challenge. I am pleased that the White House released a legislative proposal on Tuesday developed through the interagency process that was initiated in April. The proposal seeks to strengthen SCRIM's efforts across the SCRM efforts across the government, enhance information sharing, and harden the Federal procurement process to identify and mitigate threats. Additionally, I want to highlight that DHS is making great strides to implement SCRIM measures throughout the Department. Last year, DHS issued policy directives for high-value assets requiring that all DHS components develop and implement SCRIM strategies for sensitive payments, educate and train staff and contractors about supply chain risks, and enforce good supply chain hygiene by establishing contractual requirements and audit mechanisms for suppliers. The purpose of today's hearing is to review current capabilities and authorities and assess whether additional authorities are needed to better protect the Department of Homeland Security supply chain. The Department of Defense and the intelligence community have existing authorities to block certain procurement efforts if security risks are identified. Even now, more is being done to protect this sensitive supply chain. The recently passed National Defense Authorization Act enhances DOD's authorities, and the Intelligence Authorization Act, which is on the floor today, further strengthens the intelligence community's SCRIM toolkit. As a national security agency, it is vital that DHS also have robust supply chain risk management practices and tools to identify, mitigate, and remove potential threats to its systems and contracts. In addition to reviewing the OMB proposal, both subcommittees are working on specific legislation to provide DHS with similar SCRIM authorities to DOD. At the end of the day, the ability of any agency to address supply chain risk survives on a robust intelligence framework. The foundation of any SCRIM program is the ability to proactively identify entities seeking to exploit the DHS acquisition process, become trusted vendors, and then steal from or otherwise harm the Homeland Security enterprise. In order to fully understand DHS intelligence SCRIM capabilities and specific threats to the supply chain, I expect that after an initial round of questions in the open session, we move to a closed session to better discuss those issues. I again want to thank the witnesses for being here and express appreciation for Chairman Perry and Ranking Member Correa for working with us on this joint hearing. I am pleased to recognize the Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism Intelligence, the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman King and Chairman Perry, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for coming to testify today. The Department of Homeland Security has the enormous responsibility of securing the Federal Government's vast supply chain, particularly information technology, from a wide variety of foreign threats. Today, the most pressing threats come from Chinese and Russian IT companies that until recently were used widely throughout the U.S. and by several Federal agencies. For example, last year we learned that the Russian cybersecurity company Kaspersky Lab was operating compromised antivirus software in U.S. government computers. Despite being a long-time government vendor, the FBI had reason to believe the Kaspersky programs contained backdoors that could be accessed by Russian intelligence. Thankfully, DHS acted to wipe the software from all government systems. Additionally, members of Congress have long been warned that the Chinese telecommunications companies Huawei and ZTE also posed risks to our national security. ZTE and Huawei are two of the world's largest telecommunication companies and were used widely in the U.S. However, the companies have close ties to the Chinese government and were believed to be possible vehicles for cyber threat and espionage. In 2016, we imposed stiff penalties on ZTE for violating U.S. sanctions by making hundreds of shipments of telecommunications equipment made with U.S. parts to Iran, Sudan, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba. After yet another breach in April, ZTE faced additional U.S. penalties, including a ban on U.S. suppliers selling equipment to ZTE. The following month, both ZTE and Huawei were also banned from being sold on U.S. military bases. These bans were not only warranted, but in my opinion, long overdue. These companies and their government clearly pose a threat to our national security, and we had a responsibility to act, which makes the actions of President Trump all the more surprising. It appears President Trump has placed his own business interests above our national security. Not long after a soon-to-be Trump-branded resort in Indonesia received loans from the Chinese government, the President tweeted a promise to save ZTE from the punishing penalties. Just yesterday, the Trump administration and the Chinese government signed an agreement to end the ban on U.S. exports to ZTE. The President's lack of candor and leadership on this issue, coupled with the urgent threats facing our supply chains, calls for the federal government to develop a comprehensive strategy to protect our supply chains from foreign threats. During this hearing, I hope to learn more about what the Department of Homeland Security is doing to advance their counterintelligence programs, specifically with the proposed use of Section 806 authority. I think it's also important that we know whether the White House is playing an active role in coordinating supply chain security across the federal government. But most importantly, this committee needs to know what additional resources and support are needed by supply chain risk management programs to carry out its mission effectively. As I understand, there are only 2 employees dedicated to the SCRM program, which seems completely inadequate given the task ahead. It is time that we finally listen to the intelligence community and create a comprehensive strategy to counter the mounting threats facing our supply chains. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I do hope this will be a constructive conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. And now I recognize the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Management Efficiency, Mr. Perry, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I thank you, Chairman King, for holding this hearing today and including the Oversight and Management Efficiency Subcommittee in this very important, timely discussion on the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to secure its supply chain. In today's interconnected world, the federal government is increasingly reliant on the procurement of products and services with supply chains that originate from outside our borders. DHS is no exception. Global supply chains are integral to the Department's ability to carry out the mission of securing the homeland. However, recent incidents involving government contractors and foreign-based suppliers like Kaspersky Lab, ZTE, and Huawei have shed light on the security risks associated with the global nature of supply chains. Potential threats to international supply chains ranging from interference by foreign adversaries to poor product manufacturing practices present a unique and complex challenge for both DHS and national security. To assess and counter supply chain threats, organizations employ supply chain risk management strategies which leverage risk assessments to neutralize threats associated with the global and distributed nature of modern supply chains. Risk assessments are made by utilizing open and closed source research to allow organizations to better understand their supply chain and identify the threats specific to it. To assist the federal government in this effort, the National Institute for Standards and Technology has released government-wide best practices for agencies to use as a model for their own supply chain risk management strategies. Agencies like DHS rely on contracts for products and services to carry out their daily operations. As such, in the case of the Department, ensuring supply chain security is intrinsic to the mission of ensuring national security. Unfortunately, given the threat environment, I too am concerned that the Department does not currently possess the sufficient tools to effectively carry out supply chain risk management. Under the regulations governing federal procurements, DHS maintains limited authorities to terminate procurement contracts for unforeseen circumstances and to bar irresponsible entities from doing future business with the federal government for up to 3 years. Additionally, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014 granted the Department the authority to issue binding operational directives, which are compulsory orders for federal agencies to take action to safeguard information in IT systems when a security vulnerability has been identified. Unfortunately, these authorities are generally viewed as reactive measures that open the Department up to costly liability and litigation and are not agile enough to address today's supply chain threats. DHS needs the proper authorities to be able to decisively act when a threat to its supply chain has been identified. That is why, in the near term, I will be joining with my colleague, Chairman King, in introducing legislation to provide DHS with the tools to effectively carry out supply chain risk management in order to secure its supply chain. Modeled after statutory authority given to the Department of Defense in 2011, this legislation will empower the Secretary of DHS to block entities who pose a security risk from being a DHS vendor. This legislation will also encourage information sharing across the Department when a supply chain risk has been identified. Again, I thank our distinguished panel for testifying this morning, and I look forward to learning more about supply chain risk management at the Department. It is my intention to use today's discussion to help further shape a legislative solution for securing DHS's supply chain. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. I'm pleased that our two subcommittees are working together to address this vital issue, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Correa, for an opening statement.
Chairman Perry, Chairman King, and Vice Chairperson Rice for today's hearing. This morning, the two subcommittees will hear from witnesses on DHS's current authority on mitigating threats to our supply chains. We urgently need a national strategy for supply chain risk management. Foreign national states like Russia and China view information and communication technology as a strategic sector in which they have invested significant capital and exercise tremendous influence. IT products and services through the global supply chain are threats that continue to evolve every day. Bad actors to continue to target U.S. government contractors and other private sector entities that do business with the government and try to gain advantage and undermine our security. Over the past year, DHS has mitigated the risks and secured the government supply chain. DHS launched a new Supply Chain Risk Management, or SCRM, program. While the goals of the program are commendable, its mission far exceeds its resources. As of this May, there are only 2 employees dedicated to the program. I hope to work with the Department and my colleagues to cross the aisle to provide this office with the proper resources and manpower it deserves. Lastly, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses on how the DHS SCRM program fits into the federal government's overreaching approach to supply chain security. Without a cybersecurity coordinator within the administration, I'm also concerned about consolidation efforts underway within multiple federal agencies to address the national security implications of supply chain vulnerability. The federal government supply chain is a target for our adversaries, and we need to ensure that commercial off-the-shelf goods and services are not the subject of manipulation. It's imperative that we streamline these efforts to better protect against supply chain threats, and I hope to work with the administration to that end. With that, I yield.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you, Mr. Correa. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And now I would like to ask unanimous consent that the chairman of the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, Mr. Donovan, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. You owe me one, Dan. We are grateful to have a very distinguished panel here today to testify before us. And let me remind the witnesses that their entire written statements will appear in the record. Our first witness, Ms. Soraya Correa, did I get that right? Okay, good. Serves as the Chief Procurement Officer for the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Correa provides leadership, policy, oversight, support, and professional workforce development for the DHS contracting workforce of approximately 1,500 individuals. As a senior procurement executive, she also oversees a centralized certification and training program for the DHS acquisition workforce and also assists the Chief Acquisition Officer in managing major acquisition programs. Prior to being appointed to this position in January 2015, Ms. Correa served as the Associate Director of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service Enterprise Services Directorate. The Chair now recognizes Ms. Correa for opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman King, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Correa, and Ranking Member Price, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss ways the Department of Homeland Security can enhance its ability to effectively manage supply chain risk in the procurement process. As the Chief Procurement Officer and Senior Procurement Executive for the Department, I am responsible for the DHS procurement line of business. My DHS colleagues will speak to supply chain risk and the Department's response to this risk. I am here to discuss the additional authority needed to ensure the procurement process can effectively and efficiently address identified threats and vulnerabilities in the supply chain while protecting intelligence information. The DHS national security and cybersecurity mission warrants additional authority in order to protect its systems and networks. From a procurement perspective, it is essential that we promote business processes and use authorities that enable us to be more consistent in our training, implementation, and management of those authorities across the government. If we do, we can improve understanding and ease implementation for industry, especially for new companies and small businesses. Today, federal agencies are finding increasing similarities in the products and services that we acquire, in the ways we work with the various industries, and in national security considerations that impact our mission. Therefore, providing certain authorities for use across the federal government to ensure a fair and effective process for addressing supply chain risks throughout the acquisition lifecycle is essential. I would like to briefly describe how the rules governing the procurement process impact DHS when the department needs to take action on intelligence information. Currently, DHS contracting officers, or COs, regardless of their security clearance level, are unable to receive specific intelligence information. Instead, COs are advised broadly that there is a risk and provided the potential mitigation strategies to offset that risk, or they are advised if there is a risk that cannot be mitigated. When a risk cannot be mitigated, there are sufficient authorities in a classified procurement to take immediate action. However, in an unclassified procurement, where the vast majority of DHS procurements are actually conducted and administered, the CO's actions are restricted because the process is designed to balance the equities of the contracting parties, ensuring due process for contractors and full disclosure of the government's reasons for pursuing contractual remedies in the event of a performance or integrity failure. The Federal Acquisition Regulation and underpinning statutes were designed around the procurement of commodities and services that were neither anticipated to be vulnerable to, nor the target of, the sophisticated foreign intelligence activities witnessed in recent years, especially those associated with a globalized information and communications technology supply chain. In fact, during the pre-award process, or during the pre-award phase of the competitive procurement process, which includes the evaluation of proposals submitted by competing vendors, a CO cannot take action on intelligence information if it would preclude the further participation of an interested vendor. The competitive process is designed to ensure fair and equitable treatment of participating vendors, thereby requiring sufficient transparency in the government's decisions to exclude a vendor. Ideally, we need to anticipate risks in our planning phase and find mitigation strategies before we begin the procurement process. Unfortunately, sometimes risks are not identified until a particular vendor or their proposed solution is evaluated. While we will always turn to our DHS colleagues to mitigate such risks, additional authority is needed for those instances when the risk cannot be mitigated and the vendor or a particular product or service must be excluded. There are existing authorities to manage risk on awarded contracts. These include temporary stop work orders, termination of contracts, and suspension and debarment actions as appropriate. However, these remedies were not designed to address a security threat, based on intelligence information. I'd like to make an important point before I close. As the Department's Chief Procurement Officer and Senior Procurement Executive, I take my obligations to maintain the integrity of the procurement process seriously. This is why I support strong safeguards against the abuse of any authorities granted to enhance our ability to protect the supply chain and protect intelligence information used in the procurement process. Therefore, I support ensuring accountability at a high level within the department for use of such authority, as well as appropriate fact-finding resulting in well-documented determinations. Thank you again for your interest in this very important matter, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Correa. Appreciate that. Our second witness, Dr. John Zangotti, is the Chief Information Officer for DHS. Previously, Dr. Zangotti served as the DoD Principal Deputy Chief Information Officer and later the Acting Chief Information Officer. Dr. Zangotti's background includes acquisition, policy, legislative affairs, resourcing, and operations. He is a retired naval flight officer and served in a variety of command and staff assignments. And the Chair now recognizes Dr. Zangotti. Thank you for being here today.
Chairman King, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Correa, Ranking Member Rice, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to discuss ways to improve the Department of Homeland Security's ability to effectively manage supply chain risk. The Department's Secretary has two primary sets of supply chain risk management responsibilities related to information and communications technology. In one set, the Secretary is responsible for procurement and supply chain risk management within DHS's information and communications environment. These responsibilities are carried out by DHS's Chief Procurement Officer and the Chief Information Officer. In carrying out the other set of responsibilities, the Secretary of DHS, in consultation with the Office of Management and Budget, administers the implementation of government-wide information security policies and practices. These responsibilities are carried out by the National Protection and Programs Directorate, or NPPD. My focus today will be on the supply chain risk management activities within DHS's information and communications technology environment. Gaps exist in the Department's authority to use intelligence to support its procurement decisions when a significant supply chain risk cannot be mitigated. Mitigation is the preferred and least disruptive method of addressing supply chain risk. However, in those exceptional cases where mitigation is not possible, the Department needs the capability to react swiftly while appropriately restricting the disclosure of other national security sensitive information. The administration has been working to establish a strategic statutory framework to protect our federal supply chain by conducting supply chain risk assessments, creating mechanisms for sharing supply chain information, and establishing exclusion authorities, both within agencies and in a centralized manner, to be utilized when justified. We look forward to supporting the administration's work with Congress on the bill and strengthening our ability to execute mission in an environment of changing vulnerabilities and threats. DHS needs flexibility while protecting the integrity of the procurement process. DHS will ensure important safeguards such as requiring factual findings, written determinations, and concurrences by specified senior DHS officials are in place when the authority as proposed by the administration is used. We do not see using this authority to drive sole source procurements. Competition, particularly in the IT space, is critical to ensure that DHS gets the best solution at the right cost. DHS procedures will facilitate the timely assessment and mitigation of risk and preclude compromising DHS systems. It is key to ensure we have a strong process surrounding supply chain risk management. A strong supply chain risk management process needs to ensure that vendors are queried on supply chain risk process, there is awareness of the systems on the network and a rapid response to intelligence tippers, and there's close working relationship with the component CIOs and CISOs, the Chief Procurement Officer, the acquisition community, intelligence, and NPPD. As the IT technical authority for DHS, my Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, has initiated work to directly support and execute technical assessments, providing subject matter expertise, and be the integration point for all enterprise supply chain management efforts. In addition, this team will develop program documentation that will align with current policies and procedures while providing programmatic subject matter expertise to DHS stakeholders and risk owners. With the support of the DHS components and offices, my team will continue to focus on governance by enhancing policy, procedures, and compliance monitoring capability of Scrum activities, services, by providing supply chain risk management services such as information and communications technology assessments and intelligence analysis reporting, and operations, which includes the execution and implementation of supply chain risk management recommendations in selected IT acquisitions. DHS recognizes the importance of establishing an enterprise approach to managing supply chain risk associated with information and communications technology. The supply chain for information and communications technology is complex. We have our work cut out for us. Working closely with our partners, we will find the best and most realistic approach for strengthening our supply chain. The Department appreciates the support of this committee on these important matters. We will continue to work with Congress to address existing gaps in authority or resources required to effectively manage supply chain risk within DHS. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zangotti. Our third witness, Ms. Jeanette Manfra, serves as the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at the National Protection and Programs Directorate within DHS. Ms. Manfra leads the Department's mission of strengthening the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. Prior to this position, she served as the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity and the Director for Strategy, Policy, and Plans for the NPPD. Ms. Manfra served in the U.S. Army as a communications specialist and a military intelligence officer, and I now recognize Ms. Manfra for opening statement. Thank you.
Chairman King, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Correa, Ranking Member Rice, members of the subcommittees. Thank you for today's opportunity to discuss the Department's ongoing efforts to assess and mitigate supply chain risk. The information and communications technology supply chain is a source of significant risk. The globalization of our supply chain results in component parts, services, and manufacturing from sources distributed around the world. Vulnerabilities in technology can be created intentionally or unintentionally through a variety of means, including deliberate mislabeling and counterfeits, unauthorized production, tampering, theft, and insertion of malicious software or hardware. If these risks are not detected and mitigated, the result is adverse impacts to essential government or critical infrastructure systems. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence acknowledges that the U.S. is under systemic assault by foreign intelligence entities who target the equipment, systems, and information used every day by government, business, and individual citizens. Our adversaries are able to use the supply chain's complexity to obfuscate their efforts to penetrate sensitive research and development programs, steal intellectual property and personally identifiable information, insert malware into critical components, and mask foreign ownership, control, and/or influence of key providers of components and services. Cyber supply chain risk management requires addressing product security throughout its life cycle, including design, development, acquisition, distribution, deployment, maintenance, and product retirement. Current law governing information security for federal information resources requires agencies to implement an agency-wide information security program that ensures that information security, including supply chain security, is addressed throughout the life cycle of each agency information system. At the National Protection and Programs Directorate, or NPPD, we carry out the Secretary's responsibilities to administer the implementation of government-wide information security policies and practices and to coordinate the overall federal effort to enhance the security and resilience of our nation's critical infrastructure. These statutory responsibilities for federal agencies include monitoring implementation, convening senior officials, coordinating government-wide efforts, providing operational and technical assistance, providing as appropriate intelligence and other information about cyber threats, vulnerabilities, and incidents, and developing and overseeing implementation of binding operational directives, among other actions. We leverage the full range of these authorities to address supply chain risks across the federal government. In January 2018, we at NPPD established a cyber supply chain risk management program to facilitate national efforts to address risks to the information and communications technology supply chains of federal agencies, critical infrastructure owners and operators, and state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. We are working with DoD, the intelligence community, and other agencies in these efforts. Initially, this program is focusing on identifying and addressing supply chain risks related to the federal government's high-value assets. Additionally, in partnership with the General Services Administration, we are working to bridge the gap between procurement and information technology professionals by providing awareness, training, and educational content through the Federal Acquisition Institute. Through the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, NPPD procures cybersecurity tools to deploy inside federal agency networks. Since 2017, NPPD has required CDM vendors to complete a supply chain risk management questionnaire as part of the product approval process. The questionnaire provides information to agencies about how the vendor identifies, assesses, and mitigates supply chain risks in order to facilitate better informed decision-making. The information is intended to improve the buyer's understanding of how the products are developed, integrated, and deployed. as well as the processes, procedures, and practices used to assure the integrity, security, resilience, and quality of those products. Before closing, I would note that this administration is working to establish a strategic framework to protect our federal supply chain by conducting supply chain risk assessments, creating mechanisms for sharing supply chain risk and mitigation information, and establishing exclusion authorities, both within agencies and in a centralized manner, to be utilized when justified. As the Department works to address the risk posed by increasingly sophisticated adversaries, we appreciate the committee's interest in this topic and the work that you've done, and look forward to working with members and your staff on these issues. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Manfred. Appreciate that. Our fourth witness is Mr. Gregory Wilshosen, the Director of Information Security Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. Wilshosen leads information security-related studies and audits of the federal government. He has over 30 years of auditing, financial management, and information system experience, and the Chair now recognizes Mr. Wilshosen for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman King, Chairman Perry, Ranking Members Rice and Correa, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on the Homeland Security supply chain. Information technology systems are essential to the operations of the federal government. These systems are created and delivered through a complex global supply chain that involves a multitude of organizations, individuals, activities, and resources. My testimony today provides an overview of the information security risks associated with the supply chains used by federal agencies to procure IT systems. As requested, I will also discuss our 2012 assessment of the extent to which 4 national security-related agencies, the Departments of Defense, Justice, Energy, and Homeland Security, had addressed these risks. Before I do, if I may, I would like to recognize 2 members of my team, Jeff Knott and Rosanna Guerrero, for their efforts in developing my statement. Thank you. In several reports issued since 2012, we have pointed out that the reliance on complex global IT supply chains introduces multiple risks to federal information and communication systems. This includes the risk that these systems are being manipulated or damaged by leading foreign cyber threat nations such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Threats and vulnerabilities created by these cyber threat nations, vendors or suppliers closely linked to cyber threat nations, and other malicious actors can be sophisticated and difficult to detect, and thus pose a significant risk to organizations and federal agencies. As we reported in March 2012, supply chain threats are present at various phases throughout a system's development lifecycle. These threats include insertion of harmful or malicious software and hardware, installation of counterfeit items, disruption in the production or distribution of essential products and services, reliance on unqualified or malicious service providers, and installation of software and hardware containing unintentional vulnerabilities. These threats can be exercised by exploiting vulnerabilities that can exist at multiple points in the supply chain. Examples of these vulnerabilities include weaknesses in agency acquisition practices, such as acquiring products or parts from sources other than the original manufacturer or authorized reseller, incomplete information on IT suppliers, and installing hardware and software without sufficiently inspecting or testing them. These threats and vulnerabilities can potentially lead to a range of harmful effects, including allowing adversaries to take control of systems, extract or manipulate data, or decrease the availability of resources needed to develop or operate systems. In March 2012, we reported that the Departments of Defense, Justice, Energy, and Homeland Security varied in the extent to which they had addressed IT supply chain risks. Of the 4 agencies, Defense had made the most progress and had implemented several risk management efforts. Conversely, the other 3 agencies had made limited progress addressing supply chain risks for their information systems. We made 8 recommendations to Justice, Energy, and DHS to develop and document policies, procedures, and monitoring capabilities that address IT supply chain risk. The agencies subsequently implemented 7 recommendations and partially implemented the 8th. These actions better positioned the agencies to monitor and mitigate their supply chain risks. In summary, the global IT supply chain introduces a myriad of security risks to federal information systems that, if realized, could jeopardize the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the systems and the information they contain. Thus, the potential exists for serious adverse impacts on the agency's operations, assets, and employees. These factors highlight the importance of federal agencies appropriately assessing, managing, and monitoring IT supply chain risks as part of their agency-wide information security programs. Chairman King, Chairman Perry, Ranking Members Rice and Correa, and other members of the subcommittee, this concludes my oral statement. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
And you still have 17 seconds to go. Good job. Thank you very much, Ms. Wilshosen. So I appreciate all you being here today, and I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. A number of us on the panel believe that DHS should have powers similar to DOD, similar to Section 806. Now, I guess I would ask the 3 representatives from DHS how that would strengthen you if similar legislation was adopted for DHS. But also, looking back on it, it appears that this was DOD was given this authority in 2011, did not issue regulations until 2015, and I don't even know if they've begun to implement them yet. So if this authority is given to you, how quickly would you be able to implement it, and how would it improve your capabilities? Ms. Correa?
So, sir, I've looked at the authority, and I've also looked at the proposal that's been put before the latest legislative proposal. We would act very quickly and swiftly to implement. We would look at our business process to see how we can immediately train our staff and ensure that they have a full understanding of what this authority grants us to do. And we would issue immediate guidelines and instructions, including to our employees, but also to share with industry on how we would use that authority. But the very specifics, the timeline, I would have to go back and look at how quickly we could actually implement.
Sir, thank you. I concur with Soraya. The need for this type of capability or authority is important from a CIO's perspective. My responsibility that I have to take under consideration and work very hard every day is the security of the DHS network, just not for the headquarters, but for the components. Having the ability to react swiftly, to make the right decisions with removal of network systems or IT systems that are threatening is very important for us in carrying out our mission. We will work very closely with the intelligence community and MPPD on tippers, so we know what's going on. My team will do the technical assessment and talk very closely with the Chief Procurement Officer to make sure the lines of communication and what we're doing is very clear and understandable.
Ms. Manfred?
The only thing I would add was to just note that administration proposal would be for this authority to be granted government-wide. And so in addition to DHS having this ability, we want all of the executive branch to be able to have this authority and this capability.
This is, I guess, the open question to you. Do you have sufficient personnel on board now to carry out your mission?
I'm sorry. The question was, I want to make sure I understood.
Do you have sufficient personnel on board now to carry out this mission?
To carry out this mission, from a procurement perspective, the answer is yes, because we would be relying on our contracting officers, our policy and legislative team, who actually implement any accompanying guidelines. We put out guides. We do this on a very regular basis. So the answer is yes, we have the staff that can do this right now.
Doctor?
Sir, from a CIO perspective and with regards to my mission for protecting the DHS network, I feel that I have sufficient folks on board in my shop. I also feel that the communication between the technical folks in my CISO shop and the component chief information security officers and CIOs is more than adequate to carry this out.
Manfred?
Our role would be different in that we wouldn't necessarily be in charge of implementing this authority for the department. We're looking across the federal government and building an initiative to ensure that supply chain risk assessments are being done, that we are following up and potentially providing continuous monitoring. We have just started building that program. As noted, we currently do only have 2 people solely identified for that, but we are building that program, and we're recently appropriated some additional program dollars. So that program will be built over the next 2 years to get to full capacity.
Down to 40 seconds. Mr. Wilshausen, based on your studies of other departments, including DHS over the years, if we did give 806 authority to DHS, how long do you think it would take them to implement it?
That I wouldn't know exactly, but I would say that one of the key things with the 806 authority given to DHS is making sure that this committee and GAO and/or the inspectors general have an opportunity to review the process and the procedures that the department implements in order to affect that particular capability and authority that it has. It's just making sure that one is able to review what DHS does in implementing it and making sure it's done in accordance with the law.
Thank you. Ms. Rice?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Correa, I'd like to start with you. This hearing is about some of the threats we face from adversarial foreign governments. I think in order to counter these threats, we must first fully acknowledge them and their intentions. So with that in mind, do you agree with the intelligence community's January 2017 assessment and the Senate Intelligence Committee's findings that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to benefit the Trump campaign?
So, ma'am, I'm not intimately familiar with that information. What I can tell you is that I agree that we have to have the authorities in place.
Okay, I have to stop you there.
Sorry.
In your position, you are saying you can't answer this question.
Not directly, no, ma'am.
How about indirectly?
That's what I was trying to do, that I believe we have to have the mechanisms in place to address these vulnerabilities and ensure that the threat assessments, the risks, the vulnerabilities are properly addressed through the procurement process.
You are the Chief Procurement Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, and you do not have an opinion about whether the Senate Intelligence Committee's findings and the entire intelligence community's findings that Russia interfered with the 2016 election to support President Trump. You have no opinion about that.
Ma'am, unfortunately, no.
That is
not with
frightening.
respect to this.
Frightening to me. How about you, Doctor?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes or no? Do you agree with the findings?
Ma'am, I'm here to testify on this authority.
No, you're here to answer questions, and you're talking about actions that all of you are taking on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security regarding interference, whether it's procurement process or whatever it is. If we can't get people here, all 4 of you, to acknowledge that there was interference in the 2016 election, none of you should be in the positions that you are in to protect us in 2018 or 2020. So yes or no, do you have an opinion about whether Russia interfered in the 2016 election? Yes or no?
Ma'am, my responsibility is to protect the DHS network.
Your responsibility is to answer the question. Yes or no?
Ma'am,
Say no.
I do not have an opinion.
Say you have no opinion. Again, frightening. Okay, let's move on to Ms. Manfra. Yes or no? Do you agree with the opinions of the entire intelligence
I agree
community?
with the intelligence community assessment, ma'am, and I've said so publicly previously.
Thank you.
I would also have to agree with the Intelligence Committee, but
Thank you.
again, I haven't examined it.
I appreciate your willingness to answer a question that everyone on the panel should be able to answer. Despite warnings from the Federal Communications Commission, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Defense, and other intelligence agencies, President Trump publicly expressed support for the Chinese telecommunications company ZTE. Ms. Correa, I'll start with you. Have you discussed your concerns with the Chinese telecommunications companies with President Trump?
No, ma'am, I have not had any discussions with the president.
Have you discussed it with the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security?
No, ma'am, no, I have not.
And you're the chief procurement, head of procurement.
That's correct.
Again, a frightening, frightening answer. Do you think you should speak to her about that?
Ma'am, I work in conjunction with my colleagues and look at what the risks are to
Okay,
address
so
them
again,
through
you're
the
not going to
procurement
answer the
process.
question. Doctor, how about you? Have you had any discussions?
No.
Or about, do you have any concerns about the president's approach to ZTE? Whatever his motivations are, we don't even have to go into them. Do you, in your position, have concerns about the president's stated position about ZTE? Yes or no?
Ma'am, I've made sure that the network has no ZTE equipment on it.
Okay, so I'm going to answer for you. That would be yes, you do have concerns?
Ma'am, my responsibility is for the network for DHS, and I have ensured that the appropriate steps have been taken to preclude the use of equipment.
So is there a reason why you can't say, answer a question in a way that might come across as being critical of the president? Is there a reason? Because I've never heard an inability from Ms. Correa and you to answer a simple yes or no question. So I'm just wondering why you can't or won't.
Ma'am, my position is to work and ensure that the network is safe every day, and that's what I do.
Okay, and what's frightening to me is that people like you are in the positions that you're in who will not make statements of fact that everyone in the intel community has made. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I want to thank at least the two of you for being willing to answer what I think is a pretty simple question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. Without getting into a debate, we can have it. First of all, it was not all the components of the intelligence community. It was the FBI and the CIA, and DNI agreed in part. The other 14 did not take a position, and there are legitimate questions about the extent of the involvement. I have no doubt there was meddling. We can debate it in another forum, but having been through 65, 70 witnesses on the Intelligence Committee on this, it is not as clear as you may think as far as who they were favoring. There was no doubt there was meddling, but again, it was only Brennan and Comey who agreed in full with that recommendation. Ms. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the witnesses for their testimony and answering some questions for us here. We're trying to get to the process, I think, and understand the process that you all go through, and then find out how we, from a legislative and policy standpoint, can support your efforts. And I think all of us, regardless of our political affiliation, don't want us to be on defense, don't want us to be reactive, want us to be proactive, and I think that's what we're trying to get to. So I'm trying to understand, and so my questions will be in that vein. I'm wondering what the DHS does to recognize and address that might already exist from products that are currently implemented or being used by the department. How does that process work? Is there a continual reevaluation? And I'm thinking in the context of, you know, I've got two of these things, and I've got a couple iPads, and then desktop computers, and I don't know what the schedule is, but on a pretty regular basis, you know, you got to put in your code and update the software and all that stuff. And I'll be honest with you, I have no idea what's happening in there. Something's happening, right? But I'm hoping that you folks do and deal with that, and I'm trying to understand how that works. If any one of you can answer that question, you know.
So, sir, you know, the current IT environment, as mentioned by the other witnesses, is global. It's complicated. It's characterized by mergers and acquisitions in an ever-changing territory. So we have to work very hard to deal with that. So intelligence tippers is really a key way in which we start the process. But more importantly, backing up within the whole acquisition process, we have to be involved at the very beginning as a program is being looked at to determine what systems, hardware components, software are going in there. And we've developed a set of questions that have to be answered by every program. We've also, in our 4300A handbook, developed a requirement for the components and the programs to develop policies related to supply chain management. So we've put those in place. My chief technical officer also vets all software against the State Department Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. So these are embedded in the process as we're going forward to build something out. So when we're notified about a risk, we look at it very closely from a technical point of view and determine if it's something that we should mitigate or remove. Removal takes time. It isn't an overnight process. So mitigation might involve something simple like setting configurations or settings on a firewall. My ESOC, or my Enterprise Security Operations Centers, monitors this on a daily basis, looking for proxy signals. They monitor it daily, and they will tip off if they find anything. We also do scans of our network and review the logs to ensure that nothing is, askew. We work very closely with the CISOs and the component CIOs to ensure that the communication and standards are set. I think part of your question deals with making sure that patches and other things are done to make sure the network is monitored and upgraded to the current standards. I view cyber hygiene as part and parcel of what I do. What I mean by cyber hygiene is ensuring that we're moving to modern operating systems, that our patching's done up to date and as soon as possible, and we're doing things like two-factor authentication and PKI.
A lot of this is pretty technical for all of us, and we just, I hate to say it, but we're counting on you folks to have the technical expertise that's necessary. Just out of curiosity, is DHS using software products with Russian-based security codes such as Kaspersky, NGINX, Nordicand, Oxygen? I know I see a U.S. Secret Service request for DHS 20 licenses from Oxygen, which is a Russian-based company, and I'm wondering, as a matter of protocol, does DHS look into, I imagine, but I just want to be sure, relationships with the Russian government, and, well, I'll just leave it at that, if you can answer those questions.
So, sir, we do, and we take that into account as part of our technical assessment.
Wait, you use those?
So, no,
okay,
no,
yeah.
sir, you asked if I take that into account.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, right?
Yes, sir. So we take it into account to make sure that as part of our technical assessment, we consider the leadership of companies, where the company's based, those sort of qualitative factors, if you will.
Do you know if you use any of the companies that I listed?
So, sir, I would have to take some of that as a QFR for
Okay.
companies like
If
Huawei
you could,
and
please, I'd
ZTE.
like to, yeah,
We do not have any Huawei or ZTE.
And I'm happy to know that. Let me ask you this. Does DHS have a requirement for the companies that you procure from that determines what security standards they have? Somebody's writing the code, somebody's building the piece of equipment. Does DHS have a requirement, there's a minimum standard, a minimum security standard, background checks, et cetera, for the vendors or the producers? Is that something that is a part of what you do, Ms. Correa?
Yeah, yes, sir. We actually vet the vendors, and we do have security standards that are specified in the actual solicitation, as well as we include cyber hygiene clauses that are in the contracts and solicitations as determined by the program offices and the CIO for inclusion, that identify the different documentation and the standards that they have to meet, the training that they have to take, and the documents that they have to submit for us to validate that they are meeting the security
So
standards.
one final question with the chair's indulgence. I wonder why it took so long to identify Kaspersky as a risk. It seemed to me, look, I come from Pennsylvania state government. We use Kaspersky throughout the state government as our security vendor, and through the complaints, we kept using it until finally the federal government said, hey, there's a problem here. What took so long?
I can take that one, sir. I can't comment in detail about maybe why it took so long. I can tell you for when I was in my position, we looked in and working with our intelligence analysis, looked into all the available information, both classified and unclassified, and just came to a point that this was not a risk that we were willing to accept on our networks. And that's when we began the process of identifying tools available to remove them from our networks, and that led to the binding operational directive.
So from a layman's standpoint, and I'll close with this, it seems to me that people like me would think as soon as you see anything questionable, as soon as you see anything questionable from a country like Russia, China, Iran, or whatever that we're buying things like this from, that's a problem, and we should terminate it. But I'll close with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, you.
Yeah, I would just join the gentleman in saying that I know for a number of years we're hearing about Kaspersky, and I can never understand why we retain them. But in any event, Mr. Correa, you recognize.
Thank you very much. I only have 5 minutes here, so let me try to be succinct, and appreciate succinctness to your answers to my questions. But, you know, recently the administration seems to have changed position on Huawei and ZTE. Does that change your perspective, your view on the security threat that these products pose on the supply chain? Meaning, are we okay to buy them now? Are you going to buy them? Or is this not change your perspective on the threat of ZTE and Huawei to our national security?
Sir, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by changing positions if you're referring to the commerce actions on ZTE.
Yes.
So that's specific to ZTE, not Huawei. I would say, similar to what we discussed with Kaspersky, what we're looking at is less about the company and more about the laws that company is compelled to follow. Both Chinese and Russian laws compel access that we're concerned about. So what we are doing is a risk assessment on companies that are subject to those laws and looking at the tools that we have available to us to address that risk.
So when you say we're looking at the risk assessment, what would change of that risk assessment? It's my understanding that certain countries, Russia and China being two, are generally their style of economy, so to speak. Those companies are essentially controlled or are accountable to their central government. So that model of operating would never change, at least not in the short term. So I'm trying to figure out is I guess our classification of ZTE would change. What would change in your assessment of that company and how we would do business with them in the U.S.?
I'd want to separate the commerce action on ZTE, which was a specific action for something that they violated, from our work in assessing risk. And we can walk through some more details in the closed session. But just at a high level, we're looking at risk both now and
Let me
in the
pull you
future.
back then, given that we'll go through that in closed section. But a bigger general question, if mitigation versus removal. Chain of command. You all operate under a chain of command, I presume. There are certain issues you need to bring forth to the committee, individuals that can respond to give you authority, and so on and so forth, respond to your concerns. Do you have the ability to jump above the chain of command should you feel that your issues are not being addressed, to bring your concerns forth?
I haven't experienced that. I have the full support of the Secretary. And
Same question to all of you, and yes, no also.
Yes, sir. I feel that I have the full support of the Secretary, and if there's an issue, I can go up the chain of command. In fact, I have a dual reporting chain to the Secretary and to the Undersecretary for Management.
Ms. Correa?
Similar to Dr. Zangardi, we're in the same reporting chain, so I report to the Undersecretary for Management, who reports to the Secretary, and we do have the ability to raise concerns on any procurement-related matters.
And would you say that your concerns are responded to affirmatively, mean they're addressed?
Yes, I can say
Yes.
yes, that my
Yes.
concerns are addressed.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
yes, sir.
Yes.
Well, I'm with GAO, and I certainly have can go up to the Comptroller General if I have a concern about any issue, but I haven't had that yet.
You know, and I only have less than a minute, and I wish I could delve into this a little bit more, but I guess my concern, and, you know, back of my head here, I'm thinking mitigation versus removing. You know what countries pose a threat. You know geopolitically the challenges out there. They're not new. They continue to be what they are. And so, to me, if you have a bad actor that has acted poorly or badly in the past, mitigation versus removing, I'm not sure if the difference would be or why we would go back to dealing with certain firms knowing the threats that they present to our country. I have only 15 seconds, so let me make a closing statement, and then you can answer, which is, you know, a lot of the stuff that's been going on, my thought in the back of my mind, at what point do these intrusions by these foreign governments represent a declaration of war in our country or not? And because a lot of the stuff they're doing is, you know, essentially posing a threat to us either today or in the future. If you have any comments, Mr. Chair, I'm going to stop my comments, but I'd like to see if anybody can address my comments.
So I'd like to address the mitigation versus removal. So I'm going to specifically talk to mitigation. That is preferred. Now, when we say mitigation, we're not talking about continued procurement of the particular hardware or software. What we're talking about is looking at it and going, oh, is the threat major or minor? Are there simple changes that I can make to some protocols or firewall settings that preclude it from doing whatever it was going to do? And then eventually remove it. Remember, everything has to be balanced in a cost-benefit sort of equation. So if you could preclude it from being a threat with a simple mitigation, that is the preferred course of action.
Gentleman's time is, oh, anybody else have anything on that? No, okay. Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little bit older than Chairman Perry, so I really don't understand this. I'm not as old as Chairman King, but I am older than Chairman Perry, and I am sure everyone of these incredibly intelligent young folks behind you know a whole lot more about this than all of us combined. I was told once that there's more capability in this little machine than we had when we put a man on the moon in 1969. It's just amazing to me. So knowing that these items, whether it be a phone, whether it be a 911 system, or the component parts are made elsewhere, sometimes they're even put together elsewhere. Do we have in place something that will secure our security before we find a vulnerability? Or do we wait for something to happen before we realize there's a problem with the 911 system in New York City or an iPhone that's being used by a member of Congress?
So, sir, it's impossible to build a perfect defense. So we take prudent precautions to develop a security infrastructure that protects us against known and anticipated threats. We put that in place by looking at intelligence. We put that in place by understanding the technology. But I'll take it a step further. Every time we sit down with a company, and we do meet with a lot of companies, we ask them about their supply chain management process, because what you're talking about is, it is a global marketplace, and for that phone you have there, the parts come from many different countries. So we have to understand how those suppliers of the hardware and software we need are building out their product. So that's an area we focus. And as I mentioned earlier, we have procedures in our 4300 instruction that the components have to put this in place. We address this during the acquisition process by putting in place questions that the program office has to answer. My chief technical officer and my chief information security officer are very involved in the vetting of hardware and software components that we procure.
Sir, if I could just add, we model what we do in cybersecurity similar to what's practiced in physical security. So you don't just think about defense on your perimeter. You think about putting a lot of different alerts and warning capability. You think about, well, what happens if the individual gets past one perimeter? How do we deal with them elsewhere? How do we secure very high valuable assets in a highly secure way, put resources towards that, extra protections around that? That's similar to what happens in cybersecurity. It just becomes very technical. And so there's a lot of different ways that as we learn about what an adversary might be doing, that's not necessarily related to patching a specific vulnerability, where we can put what we call compensating controls in place. So if we know that an adversary leverages legitimate credentials, so they steal somebody's password and username, for example, say through spear phishing or something like that, we know that's a very common way that they'll then masquerade as a legitimate user on a network. So what we do is then we design our network so they can't just move laterally across the entire system and have access to everything. We also put in place identity monitoring, so that as part of the CDM program, so that we can see, is there a user behaving in a way that's not usual for that user to behave, and that would alert a SOC, for example. So there's a lot of different practices and technologies that are in place that can monitor for this sort of behavior that we can take action on. But again, like Dr. Zangardi said, it's not perfect. You can never have that 100% security. We just want to have a lot of layers, and we want to raise the cost for the adversary to get to those highest value targets that we're working to protect.
I remember speaking with Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan, saying they were always concerned about the attack that's already there laying dormant, not the ones that are trying now. And thinking about when this phone was made, if a component part was compromised, and it's laying dormant in all of our phones right now. And is that able to be detected? But I guess maybe we could talk about that in a closed setting as well. Let me just ask, the chairman was asking about 806 authority. Are there any other authorities? I mean, we're lawmakers. We're supposed to listen to you. You're supposed to tell us what you need, and then we're supposed to help you get there. Are there any other authorities that would help you to secure, whether it be our equipment, our systems, that you would like to see Congress pass?
I can start with, no, I do not have a laundry list. Of course, the committee's worked very hard on the authorization for our Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a name change for our organization. We're eagerly hoping that we can get that passed into law. We've have the administration's legislation proposal, which would have the 806-like authority in addition to codifying sort of the process by which the department and other agencies would be able to continuously share this information and act on it. So that full legislative proposal is really what we're looking for.
And I would like to add that I'm encouraged by that kind of legislation, because what I think is extremely important is that we have consistency across the government in how we apply our rules and how we're going to look at this process. I did want to touch on one other thing that when Dr. Zangardi was speaking, answering your previous question. We also include the assessment of what the technologies are that they're using, what the composition of the products are, and even the backgrounds of the companies as part of the proposal evaluation process. So there is a process there where we do look at companies.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, so I yield back the time that I don't have anymore.
Very generous of you. Recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, we had a hearing in the full Committee on Homeland Security about what the department is doing to try and help our local and state election apparatus to protect itself from a cyber attack. And the attack was obviously the attack that our intelligence community has told us that President Putin and the Russian government aspired to do and did indeed do against our country. And so I'm sitting here and I'm saying, we're trying to reach out to our local and state election commissioners or secretaries of state saying, we're here to help you prevent against this attack. We're the Department of Homeland Security, and we have grants to do this. So how could you possibly expect them to take it seriously if, Ms. Correa, if the Chief Procurement Officer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and Mr. Zangardi, as the Chief Information Officer, sit here in a public committee the very next day, and are saying, well, we can't tell you this happened. How can that be taken seriously? What do you say? Would you have that same comment to all our election commissioners and secretaries of states and say, you know, we can't tell you that that's happening. We're not going to publicly admit that. Ms. Correa. No, Ms. Correa.
Okay. Sir, what I'm here to do is try to identify how we can safeguard the procurement process to ensure that there are no bad actors out there and that we address any risk issue.
So you're not prepared to say who did it?
No, sir, I'm not.
Well, you know, I sat here through the last Congress with many of my colleagues saying, boy, we can't go get these radical extremists unless we call them by name. But you're not calling them by name. The people that gave a hostile attack at our country's democracy. It's the same thing I heard all through the last Congress. It's just beyond me how we're being expected to be serious. The department is expected to be taken seriously when you won't even admit it to publicly when we're trying to prevent less than 4 months away another attack. I just have a question on ZTE now. Mr. Zangardi said, well, we're not going to consider any ZTE products or apparatus. But I was listening to Mr. Manford and said, well, we really look at the technical side, and we evaluate it from that, regardless of what the product would be, to see if it's safe. Don't you think that it should be automatically excluded from any procurement, not because of the technical ability of the product, but because they twice broke the law on sanctions against our country, again, with hostile countries like Iran, North Korea. Isn't that enough by itself to say, no matter how technically, how much it's technically reviewed, how much we feel comfortable with it, can you sit here and say, we are not going to, under any circumstances, use any ZTE products for Homeland Security procurement? Can you say that, Mr. Zeng, without qualification?
So my intent is to keep ZTE hardware off
No,
our
not
network.
even your personal intent, but yes or no. You're not going to do it. You're not going to use their products. They've twice broken the law.
We do not use their product, and it's based upon a technical
Well,
assessment.
obviously, you're not
sir.
using it now, but now that things have changed, can you say you will exclude it, period,
Sir.
going forward?
So our decisions need to be based upon risk and based on a
So it's not
technical-
based on their actions? Okay.
I think we need to
I think
separate
you've answered the
the,
question. One quickly, Mr. Wilshausen. Conclusion of your report dealt with the serious adverse impacts and risks that are here. Can you give us like what you think are among the most serious quickly? This is pretty serious stuff.
Sure. If an adversary is able to install malicious software or hardware into an information system, they may be able to extract or change, modify, even delete very sensitive information that may be residing on that system. And that can, of course, depends upon the system and what type of information it contains on that system, but it could be personally identifiable information, proprietary information, or national security, public health
National security and public health.
related information.
Thank you. Thank you. That's something for us all to think very carefully about in relation to my prior questions. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back unless there's further questions. This concludes the public portion of the hearing, and I ask unanimous consent that the subcommittees now recess for a brief period and reconvene the hearing in a closed session pursuant to House Rule 11-2G2, and we plan to reconvene in HVC 302 in 10 minutes. Without objection, the subcommittees will recess.
It's outrageous. Outrageous. They have no right being in the positions that they're in if they don't take a position like that. No right.
They're not going to put their jobs at risk.
Well, guess what? Then
Ouch.
Are you
Watch
an
out.
American or are you, you get a job
Yeah.
somewhere else?
Yeah,
Give
that's
me a fucking
correct.
break.
Well, and DHS already agreed to it. Like, DHS said yes. And they said yes, yesterday at the hearing.